So, good evening. Thank you all.
Evening, Doug.
Thank you all for coming. So let's talk about this stuff. So the topic tonight is when the railroad came to Hopewell and then what happened because of that. And what happened was the evolution of Hopewell into the full-up town that we know today, know and love today. So we'll look at this two different ways. First of all, with maps, so you can literally see the growth of the town as it started with a spot on the map and then grew to a village and then grew to a full-fledged town. And then we'll look at it in more detail through the eyes of the people who lived here, because they told us what they were doing and we can see what they did. So how they presented their town to others and how they worked to improve the town and how they invested their energy and their efforts and their money to make this town grow. And we'll see all that. That should keep us busy for a while. Bev kindly mentioned the Hopewell Valley History Project. This is the pitch of the talk here. Please help us save local history. Stuff is going in the dumpster every day. In the past 3 years, we have collected now over 500 documents and maps, including all the main stuff that you want to start out with, and now over 3,000 images and videos, and over 100 people have contributed material to this collection. We're just grabbing it all up, digitizing it, scanning it, photographing it, and getting it online. And then, so please help us do that. We'll, if you're interested in sharing, we'll make digital copies, share them back with you, and share them with the world at large. If you're done with them, we'll help feed them to the museum or the Historical Society or wherever they should go. So as a result of this, my presentation has a lot of words in it, and you can ignore them because it's going to be online. So all my presentations are online. Hopefully the video of this will be online. And also much more material with much more details about all this is online as well. So I'll mention that every now and then as we go on. There are more than 30 history briefs about institutions and places in Hopewell that are now written up and online, and there's summaries of them over on the table here. So that's the pitch. Thank you. If you want to get involved in all this, there's plenty of fun things to do. You can hunt out new stuff for us. You can figure out what we have and make sense out of it, and you can do research as well. I mean, there's plenty of things to do. So now we're going to start out with the maps, as I promised. So this is Hopewell Township, 1850s. You can't read much of anything, but there's not much of anything to read because there's some spots that are identified with what we now recognize as town names, but they're things like Pleasant Valley, which wasn't a town, and Hopewell's on here, but it's not really a town yet. And all the other writing you see here are farmsteads. So Hopewell Valley, 1850s is farms. 100, 200, 300 acre farmsteads, multi-generational families, and they're not running the farm as a business, they're running the farm for self-sufficiency. They're growing crops and taking care of animals for their families. If there's a surplus, they might trade it with the neighbors or something, but there's not much path to the business of selling farm products in this era. The first step to that mainly is the grist mills. So that's a place you can take raw farm products and turn them into cash because somebody's there who will grind it and get it to a market and turn it into cash. But other than that, these people are living as their parents lived and as they expect their children to live on these farms. The book in the bottom left corner is Hopewell, A Historical Geography. If you're interested in Hopewell history, you need to get this book. And if you're interested in farms, for example, there's a whole chapter on farms in Hopewell Valley there. So 1850s, here's the view. 1860s, pretty much the same. Your children are growing up. They're starting to think about, how am I going to fit into this farm story? 1870s, there's a change. There's 2 new lines on this map. Not one, but 2 railroads came crisscrossing across Hopewell. That's a whole nother story. We're not going to get into it tonight. But The part you need to know is in 1874, the Mercer and Somerset line came through the area and started operation. And in 1876, the second line, the Delaware and Bound Brook, came through the line. They crossed. You can see the lines crossing. That's the Frog War site, and Hopewell's just off to the right of that on the map. And the M&S, the Mercer and Somerset, lost the business battle, went out of business by the end of the decade, and the tracks were ripped up, and that was the end of that. And that's an important part of the Hopewell story, as we'll come to. Okay. Otherwise, it's all those same farmsteads, right? Not a whole lot has changed. So the question with the arrival of the railroad is, how fast does this change arrive? How fast do people change their behavior? How fast do people realize that something significant has happened? And thanks to the railroad and the timing, the answer is very, very quickly. So 1876, when this train station was built and the second line arrived, was the centennial of the United States of America. Big deal, events all over the world, all over the country. But it was also the year of the Philadelphia Centennial International Exhibition, the first World's Fair ever held in the United States of America. Huge deal. Now, if you're a farmer in 1850 and you hear about the World's Fair in Paris, I mean, it might as well be on the other side of the moon. But as the railroads made very clear to everybody in 1876, you could visit the Philadelphia World's Fair because it's a day trip away. You could get on the train in your hometown and they would drop you off at a train station right there in Fairmount Park, and you could join 10,000, 100,000 people a day going to the World's Fair. The world really had changed, and you can't miss it from this. I mean, it's just very clear. The newspaper clipping here talks about tens of thousands of people a morning leaving New York City to go to the World's Fair, and thousands of people a morning coming down the train line here and going to the World's Fair. Big, big deal. So the quote here in the bottom left, it's just a little quote in the newspaper. To get home from the grandeur and majesty of the Centennial Exhibition on a Friday night and go to beating a carpet the next day, no vacuum cleaners, you take your carpet outside and beat it, right? Is a contrast which the strongest mind wavers before. Okay? People got it. People got it. It was very clear what's going on and how your life might change for this, both your personal life and your business life. And then we have a second example of the change in this spectacular image. Speaking of the train, perfect. Wow, that worked great. So this photo is from 1881. And it's a promotional flyer done by Reuben Savage promoting the fact that on this day in September 1881, he took delivery of 200 tons of fertilizer on this one day. And you can see his private siding by the train station. The railroad backed up 8+ boxcars and delivered it. And you can see the horse-drawn wagons necessary to move that. So before the train, it was all horse-drawn wagons. After the train, 200 tons of fertilizer, no problem, right? No problem at all. So imagine you look at this as a farmer. You see this scene or you see this poster, and you're thinking, I have 200 acres, maybe half of that is good land that I'm cultivating or grazing on. But with fertilizers from the train, grains from the train, more animals from the train, farm equipment from the train, I could be growing significantly more on my property. And I could find something for my kids to do on my property. And by the way, this season, Reuben Savage has sold 1,200 tons of fertilizer. So your neighbors, Mr. Farmer, get it, okay? The world is changing that fast. This is only 5 years after they built this train station. So the world really is changing that fast. And if you're an entrepreneur, you're looking at this and saying, who's Reuben Savage? He's the general store owner up on Mount Rose. And in 5 years, he has his own siding, his own building, the building in the back left, left is his building for storage, and he's moving this amount of product. The potential here is just staggering, absolutely staggering. And then going back to my pitch about losing history, we have this image today. 3 years ago, we didn't know this existed. This image is a decade earlier than any photo we have of the Hopewell station. And we have it because Stephen Cohen, bless his heart, who's a collector, who's over in Pennsylvania, he's not even a Hopewell collector, saw it. It said Hopewell Station. He didn't really recognize it, but he took a flyer and got it. And then when he heard about what we were doing, he just shared it with us. Bless his heart. So that's why we have this kind of thing. Okay, so let's move forward. Maps. So now we're going to zoom in on Hopewell. And there's a whole lot of detail here, and I highlighted all kinds of interesting stuff. And so you can come back to these slides later and see all that stuff. All that matters is the yellow in the middle, okay? That's the point I'm going to be trying to make with this. I'll go through these quickly. So we're actually back to that original 1850 map. We've zoomed in on Hopewell, and this is what it shows of Hopewell, except it's not even sure what the name is. Is it Hopewell or Columbia? Yeah, I don't know. I'm just a map maker. Why would I know the answer to that? So clearly it's not a well-established town if we don't even know the name of it, right? And what is the town? It's this yellow spot in the middle here. It's maybe 10 buildings, maybe. The most important one is the Old School Baptist Church, still with us today. And then the development is around that, the hotel, a blacksmith, a couple other businesses, and a couple homes. So that's 1850. And then immediately surrounding are just farms, okay? So we jump forward to 1860. 10 years later, what's happened? Almost nothing, okay? There's a few more buildings below on the other side of what we call East Broad Street, and that's about it. That's the town, if you want to call it a town. No really more business or anything else like that. So now we're going to jump forward to 1875, 76, which is when the train lines arrived, and things changed. Boom. Okay, so in the bottom left there is that area we were looking at before, which clearly is expanded with more stuff. On the top left of the picture, there's growth up in that direction because the Mercer and Somerset line has come, and its train station is up there. Its train station is just north of the Old School Baptist Church, what we would call Mercer and Model Avenue. That's still the center of town here, as you can see. And then on the far left is the first industrial site in Hopewell, the sawmill. So we'll come back to that in a bit. And in the bottom right, suddenly we have growth on the east side of Hopewell, East Broad, and the town is expanding, and its center is going to move away from the Old School Baptist Church as a result of it. So let's jump forward again. 1887. This is an amazingly complex map, which is heinously overmarked. But again, just look at the yellow here, please. So on the left is that original area, and you can see more growth there. And you can see the second industrial site, which is a creamery. And then there's growth over here. So this block here and Blackwell Avenue going down. There's more growth down on East Broad. And then the key thing here is in the upper right. This is 1887. The Mercer and Somerset Railroad has collapsed. Its train tracks have been ripped up. And in Hopewell, unlike in Pennington, for example, the two train tracks came right next to each other through town. So when you ripped up the M&S, you exposed a whole bunch of empty space where nobody had built because there were train tracks there. So if you're a Hopewell booster and you're trying to bring business to town, you're trying to bring industry to town, that's a delicious open space there to think about developing. And that's exactly what happened in Hopewell. Model Avenue, which was the first industrial row along the railroad, has filled up pretty much, but there's all that yummy space over there on the Railroad Avenue side. A couple more maps. This is a fire map. What happened in this era was you don't send an adjuster out to check a house for insurance purposes. A mapping company came to your town and drew maps of every building in your town, annotated basically how flammable that building was, so that adjusters could write insurance. So these are tremendously valuable to us, obviously. And the thing to notice here, highlighted in blue at the top, are the sidings that are coming down from the train station. So the one on the left goes to what will become Van Dorn's lumberyard. The one on the right goes down to what will become J.B. Hill's lumberyard. You're all of an era to remember those. And then there's another one that comes down by the train. So this is a measure of the economic activity in town, that people had dedicated train lines for themselves. And then one more fire map. This is 1902. This looks really nutty. What happened here was the fire map, the guy drawing the fire map cut and paste little pieces of Hopewell and fit it on 3 pages, and then I had to cut it and uncut it and spread it out. So that's what you're seeing here. But the thing to notice is all the red along the top. This is the full realization of the industrialization of Hopewell, which is pretty much done by 1902. So we'll be talking about that. Okay? So that's the map part. You've seen how Hopewell grows. You see the industrialization, which is helping to drive that growth, driven by the fact there's a train line there. So let's go back and look at these chunks of time. And the way we do that is we use the words of the people who lived there at the time, who very kindly wrote stuff down and left it for us. Bless their hearts. So there were 2 major promotional booklets. The one in the top right is Healthful Historic Hopewell, 1897. The one in the bottom right is Hopewell, 1909, from, as you may have guessed, 1909. And each of them is 50 plus pages promoting Hopewell to new residents and also to new business, with 40 plus photos each, which are just a goldmine for us, just absolutely wonderful. And there were other special issues in the newspaper and things like that. All of this is up on the website, of course. And we can see how they're thinking from how they organize their thoughts, the topics in the books. So they talked about the historical basis of the town. They talked about the schools, because that's important for young families coming into town. They talked about banking and railroads and other kinds of local services for residents and also for business. They talked about businesses and manufacturing in town to prove there was a place where you could come and find a job and that you could start your own businesses as well. And they talked about building and real estate, because you want a place to stay when you come to town and you want to be able to build in town. So there's 2 quotes here. The middle one describes in their words why Hopewell was wonderful. It's located midway between New York and Philadelphia, which are the 2 major metropolitan centers in the United States. It's on the main line of the Reading Railroad, so it's superb for trade and travel. The town is attractive, it's picturesque, it's healthy, its citizens are wonderful. So this makes the borough a most desirable place of residence. So it's very clear how they're describing themselves and promoting themselves. And then the bottom quote, it doesn't sound so good to us today. Although Hopewell possesses much of historic interest, it does not have any of those disadvantages usually associated with ancient, old, decrepit towns. In fact, it's modern in every respect. Only 9 of the houses erected prior to 1872 are still standing today. Great, we wiped our town, and by the way, our town is historic. You got that part? Okay. So that sounds pretty awful. It's not quite as bad as it sounds. For one thing, if you think back to the 1850 map, there were only 9 buildings in town to begin with, right? And not all those buildings were things that were historic. So, for example, if you look at my Seminary Avenue talk and look at Harry Cox the barber, his building was a shack, and there was no foundation for that building, and he used it for decades, and then eventually it collapsed. So there were a number of buildings like that around Hopewell that did not last 200 years, sorry, but are still going, the rest of them are still going strong because they cleverly picked 1870 as the starting point here. So that's when the people in town knew that the train was coming, knew the town was growing, and started building more permanent structures, which are the ones we know today. Okay. So let's look at these slices of time. So the first slice is 1850s to 1870s. So that's the farms to the railroads. Okay. And so at the bottom here is a whole bunch of details if you happen to like details. Otherwise, look at the pictures and I'll wave my hands, and that's all you need. So on the top, we break down these time periods in those categories that the people were using when they described Hopewell. So the first category is the community. So what was going on within the community to promote the town. So there were, besides the Old School Baptist Church, there were new churches, new denominations, starting with the Calvary Baptist Church, which is the middle photo there. There was more investment in public schools. So the picture in the top right is the public school actually down on Broad Street. So the people of Hopewell were taxing themselves to build schools. The church communities were raising money themselves to build churches. There was a newspaper. So the bottom picture here is actually the Hopewell Herald building, which is still there right across the street here. And the first fire company in Hopewell. So again, we think of fire companies as probably a public kind of government function, but back then the government was not going to get involved in that. The borough government was nowhere ready to do that. So the town did it. The town raised the money, they bought the equipment, and they volunteered to serve on the fire company. So that's how these people made their town better. From a services point of view, big news in communications, telegraph, telephone, railroads, all coming in pretty much in the same decade. So that's obviously a huge change for everybody. And then the beginning of industrialization is the sawmill. So let's talk about that. So when I describe these things, I'll look at them two different ways. Who funded it? How did this happen in Hopewell? And then what was its purpose in Hopewell? What did it contribute to Hopewell? So the sawmill was actually an externally funded thing. So it was John Finney and A.J. Fetter. Finney was the money person. He had a major sawmill over in Lambertville. Fetter was the local guy who ran the Hopewell site. And we'll talk more about him later. And why did they come here? Because they looked up on that hill and saw a whole lot of trees. Okay. And you no longer have to put sawmills next to water to drive the mill. You can have steam mills. So look at those yummy trees. Let's make a sawmill, right? And so they did. So they built this sawmill. You can see in the map, this is the corner of Llewellyn and Model Street, which is now gone. The sawmill's gone, and what's out there now is the borough pump house at that triangular corner. They had 20-some employees. They made timber of all different sizes for all different purposes and exported almost all of it. They had an international business selling Hopewell products, which is just fascinating. And the story is the Tsar of Russia had a carriage made with Hopewell lumber. It's a story you read in multiple places. I've never seen anything definitive about it, if you know what I mean. And they also made products. They made wagon wheel components. They made axe handles and things like that. Oh, and this building was also a grain mill. So they were grinding grain in here too, as well. So the first mill, you can see in the bottom left corner, this is a Fowler drawing from the Fowler map we saw earlier. And that's the only way we have a picture of it. And in the bottom right, thanks to Elaine, is a picture of the second mill, because that first mill burnt down and they had to rebuild it. And what you see here is a tree trunk being shoved into a building, okay? And it runs a gauntlet of saws, and out the other end comes parts and lumber. Hey, that sounds pretty good, right? So this mill operated for about 50 years here in Hopewell. Now, the other issue is, how do you get trees down from the Sourland Mountain? You're a farmer on the mountain, you have plenty of trees. How do you get them down here? In 1870, right? You drag them. You hook them up to horses or mules and you drag them, okay? And so the mill had its own team of 16 mules for that kind of purpose. And the roads, which were already horrible dirt roads that are all chewed up from the wagon wheels, were further damaged by that. So what Fetter, would do is send the mules out and flatten the roads to make them more passable. So the mill operated, as I said, about 50 years, and then eventually that was the end of that. And there's no evidence of that on our landscape of any sort. But it was the first industrial site in Hopewell, and it demonstrated quite clearly there was something possible here. So let's move forward. So the next time period is the 1880s to the 1890s. So this is a really important period in the development, particularly along the railroad here, in the development of the town. So from a community point of view, we have more churches, more denominations. We have more investments in the public schools. So the middle photo here is the Model Avenue School, right across the road down there, which has since been expanded with multiple wings. A second fire company, the first one wasn't working out so well, so the people of Hopewell fundraised again, bought a whole bunch more equipment, volunteered again, and started a second fire company. That's a whole nother story. And banks. You need a local bank who's going to loan money for housing, loan money for businesses. So Hopewell privately started savings and loan, and they also started a national bank. So the Hopewell National Bank was a federally chartered national bank, and there is legal United States currency that says Hopewell National Bank on it. If you find one of those, don't lose it. Okay. There's just a couple of them around. There is a post on my website about it. It's just beautiful. From the services point of view, the big news in this period was a private water company. So again, it's obvious your town needs a water company. You need reliable water for cleanliness and health reasons. Businesses need reliable water, and you really want water to put out fires. This is important. And yet, the little local borough government was not in any way set up to start a water company. So again, the people of Hopewell, the boosters of Hopewell, invested their time, energy, effort, and money and made a private water company, set up the entire water system in Hopewell because it just had to be done. And Finney from the sawmill was one of those people who made that happen. And he saw the result of that too, because if you remember, Finney's first sawmill burnt down. And so what do you do when there's a fire in 1880? Well, you run somewhere and you ring a bell and people run to the firehouse, and then somehow somebody has to tell them where the fire is, and then they go over to where the fire is and the building's already consumed in flames. Now you need some water. Where do you find the water? Well, you hope there's a pond nearby or a well nearby, and then you're manually pumping water. The goal of a fire company in this period was not to put out the fire and save the building. The goal was to keep Hopewell from burning down, okay? If something catches on fire, it's gone. It's gone. And there were major fires down here at the intersection, 2 of them, that just wiped out entire corners of the intersection. It's gone. And all you can do is save the rest. So, but then Finney's second sawmill also caught on fire, and yet there was a water company, and there was water, and they put it out. And the article in the newspaper is just overwhelmed with how incredible this is. We put out a fire. We saved a building. It turns out if you have a reliable source of water with some water pressure, you can put out fires. Night and day, just a huge, huge difference because people invested in a private water company. Big, big deal. And then part of the result of having that water is a whole bunch of companies developing here along Railroad Avenue, so let's talk about those. So first is the creamery. This is also gone, unfortunately. This building was halfway down Model Avenue, basically where Mercer is. It's where the auto repair place is now. And if you look at the map in the top right, it's a building over by the train tracks and then a large pond by the water. So why is there a pond? Well, what's a creamery? And why do you need a creamery? Well, you need a creamery because you have a whole bunch of dairy farmers and they're milking their cows 3 times a day, and somehow it has to get to a large market to sell it. So you need a central resource where you can aggregate that stuff, process it, and then move it in bulk somewhere that you can sell it and make money from it. But it's highly perishable, obviously. So all around the area, including in Hopewell, people needed a creamery, just had to have a creamery. And what does the creamery do? It separates milk and cream. It might churn butter. The main thing it does is keep that milk cold. You know, you're not going to sell it till tomorrow. You got to keep it cold. And so the purpose of that pond was to make ice. So if you look at the labeling on the building here that's circled, the top says creamery, the bottom says ice house. Half that building was the ice house. And you run out of ice, you shut down your creamery. You're out of business. Okay? So that's why that pond is there, and that's why it's not a real pond. It's just a small depression, just enough to make ice. So the people of Hopewell needed a creamery. They tried to create one in 1881 and failed. They just couldn't get the funding together to make it happen. So somewhere around 1887, somebody started a creamery here, and we know almost nothing about it. It's very frustrating. And then in 1893 came the external funding. And in this case, sort of like the sawmill, there were two people, Hernig and Northrop. Hernig was a major dairy distributor in Philadelphia, had other creameries, and then bought this one. And then Northrop was the Hopewell guy who stayed here and ran the business here in Hopewell. And so this creamery ran about 30 years here in Hopewell. They expanded the plant, they added pasteurization, etc. But then eventually it shut down. The building then stood there for quite a while, and that pond was used for local recreation into the 40s. And the bottom left is kids fishing in that pond. We actually have a photo of that from the 40s, 39. But eventually that was filled in as a public health hazard, and now it's auto repair. There you go. Okay. Then we have lumberyards. So lumberyards are a totally different kind of business. This is a import business. This is bringing products into Hopewell in vast quantities and storing them and selling them. And we actually had two lumberyards in Hopewell. We had the Van Dorn lumberyard. You all know Van Dorn, yeah. Down the street there, and then we had the J.B. Hill lumberyard down here. So both of these lumberyards sold pretty much the same stuff: coal for heating, agricultural supplies for farmers, and then building supplies in general. And they're both run by local families and multi-generations of those families. They both ran over a century here in Hopewell. Two competing lumberyards ran for over a century in Hopewell, which is just really cool. Both of them started small and then expanded. So the Van Dorn lumberyard, in the bottom left is a map from 1890, which shows the site with a small siding coming in already, just because there was a hay press there. Eventually, A.S. Golden bought the property and expanded into the full-up lumberyard. The map in the top right shows his setup. On the left is that siding coming in with coal storage and feed and grain and that kind of stuff, and then a whole bunch of buildings for lumber. And the photo in the bottom center is his lumberyard at that time. After he died, the business was bought by J.C. Van Dorn and then passed to his sons, Bob and George Van Dorn, who are fondly remembered today. And the picture in the bottom right is Bob Van Dorn standing at the office building with his father's sign above him, J.C. Van Dorn and Sons. So they operated into the 2000s, and that site is actually still building supply, but won't be for much longer. That's another story. So it's actually much more than a century run here. The other lumberyard was the J.B. Hill lumberyard. Very similar kind of story. So in the bottom left, we have back all the way in 1875, a coal yard up in this area, the Hill area. In the bottom center is David Blackwell's business, which was coal and hay and feed by 1890. So that's pretty much in sync with what was happening at Golden's lumberyard. And then Blackwell partnered with Hill and then retired, so it became J.B. Hill's that we know and love today. So the picture in the top right shows the railroad trestle that ran all the way down to Hill's, because that's how you get coal. You run the train all the way down there and you dump coal there. And the bottom right is the lumber yard portion, which is what we now have of Hill's remaining in Hopewell. So two very similar businesses. Then there's the tomato factory, and this is a story a whole lot like the creamery, because you're talking about farmers who have a perishable product, tomatoes, and you want to get them to market. And throwing them on a horse-drawn wagon and bumping over dirt roads and driving to Trenton or Philadelphia or something is just not feasible. So what you need in Hopewell, as was done all over the area, all over the region, was a cannery. So you turn your perishable tomatoes into a non-perishable products. Sounds like a good idea. So this was a totally locally funded effort. So this was a combination of local investors and just local people and farmers all getting together and saying, we're going to make this happen. And it was a totally public company as a result of that. So we have all kinds of details on the finances and how they ran this business, which is delicious. So it had a 60-year run here in Hopewell, canning tomatoes. So just to give you a sense of what it would be like to put together a business like this, here's the timeline, right? So in March, they had an organizational meeting. They all got together in the room. They said, yeah, we'll do a canning company. And so a bunch of them went out and did site visits to different canning companies and figured out how the hell they were going to do that. Then in April, they got together and founded the company. They incorporated the company. They had the funding. They had 60 shareholders, farmers and investors, and they were ready to go. They picked a site. They hired an architect. In May, they were ready to build. They hired their builder and they started building. In June and July, they installed all the heavy equipment and got it all running. And then in August and September of the same year, they packed 215,000 cans, quart cans of tomatoes. They moved 571 tons of tomatoes. That's how these people operated. This is how people made it happen. And it's even nuttier than that, because think about the canning business. When do you can tomatoes? When you can pick tomatoes. When can you pick tomatoes? August and September. This is a 2-month business. This building operated at most for 8 weeks. If you got an early frost, if you have a bad spring, it's less than that. So this whole thing was 8 weeks of tomato canning, and that's it. So in the spring, actually earlier in the year, they'd get together, they'd figure out what they were going to do in the next year. They signed contracts with farmers for 100 acres of tomatoes that were going to be delivered here over the time. And then they got rolling. And on a good day, they could pack 10,000 cans a day. Okay, so that's 10,000 empty cans stored somewhere through all the equipment, and 50,000 tomatoes to pack in those cans coming in the door and getting packed, and then 10,000 full cans of tomatoes going somewhere. Just think of the logistics. It's astounding what they did. So, but not only was it helping the farmer and the local economy, it was also good jobs. So these were good summertime jobs for people. And in particular, they were, at various points, they were hiring 65 women. The 40 of them were the superstars, women with really sharp knives who could skin tomatoes. Because if you're going to cook tomatoes, you need to get that skin off. And these people were the superstars of the site because they could do that kind of work quickly and efficiently. So in the bottom here is a wooden crate from World War II, where the United States Quartermaster Corps has bought and stamped Hopewell canned tomatoes to send off to the war. Okay. So we've seen import business with the lumber yards. So that's supplies locally and business locally. We've seen businesses helping the farmers, the sawmill, the creamery, and the tomato factory. And then there's another kind of business, which is manufacturing. Jobs, just jobs, okay? So the boosters of Hopewell wanted to attract businesses here that would provide jobs. So what did they do? Well, today, attracting business is a government function. So countries compete with each other for the Olympics and cities compete to bring Amazon to your city. Back then, it's a private function. So the boosters got together and formed a company called the Hopewell Improvement Association, and its job was to get people to come here. So what we know is the chocolate factory, which was originally a shirt factory, they bought the land, the Improvement Association. They built the building, and then they leased it to the shirt factory. And the shirt factory on the top floor there had 100 sewing machines with 100 operators. So that's jobs. In addition to all the other jobs in the business, that's job. Unfortunately, the shirt factory left after 10 years. They got a chocolate company in here briefly and other small companies. And then in 1909, they were having trouble filling the building. So they said, hey, let's just start our own chocolate company. What the heck? So they started the Hopewell Chocolate Company. And it made Hopewell dainties, you can see in the bottom left here. And it had a good 20-some year run until it ran into the World War and the Depression, which killed it, basically. But think about this from people investing in their town point of view. So you have a chocolate company. So a whole bunch of people invested in this chocolate company. People are officers of this company. People are on the boards of this company, helping this company. But it leased its building from the Improvement Association, which was a whole bunch of people, many of the same people, investing in that company, operating in that company, making that company. And they had a mortgage from the Hopewell National Bank, the same group of people and other people investing in that. So they were 3 levels deep in investments to make this happen. This is what the people of Hopewell were doing. And just as another example, the tomato factory, J.B. Hill, who ran the lumberyard here, in his spare time was president of the tomato factory for an extended period. So that's what these people were doing, whatever it took to make Hopewell grow, which is just astounding. So the building you can see in the bottom right had writing all over it because it faced the train station and it was promoting the business. And on the end of the building, where it says Hopewell and Dainties, you can see the shadow of that writing still on that building today. So if you haven't seen it, go see it. Okay. So then our last period of time is the 1900s. And this is mainly here to fill out the story of the stuff that was happening in Hopewell. So from a community point of view, more investment in schools. So the top right here is the Hopewell High School, which we know is Borough Hall and now the fire department building. The public library was started, the museum was started. These were private fundraising across the town, people volunteering to raise the funding. The bottom right picture is the building that became the Hopewell Museum. And then also the Hopewell Fire Department. As I said before, there were 2 other fire departments which actually competed with each other and people weren't happy with them. The borough was still not ready to get in that business. So the people of Hopewell came together and started a 3rd fire company. There were actually 3 competing fire companies for a period, the Hopewell Fire Department, and eventually that consolidated and eventually the borough took it over. But that, again, that's the level of investment people were making to make things happen. From a services point of view, filling out the stuff that we expect today, gas lighting, so the streets are lit at night, what a concept. Electricity, big deal. Public water, so that private water company was eventually bought by the borough. And then the trolley arriving as well. So all of that's happening here in the early 1900s. And then the big deal from the large industrialization point of view is what we know as the Rockwell Pultronic building. So let's look at that story before we conclude. So you looked at that map and you saw all that empty space along Railroad Avenue, and then by 1900 that's been pretty filled in. But there's more empty space out there. There's what we call Somerset Street. And so Somerset was empty because the train line was there and they ripped it up. And then there was a brickyard there, and I have a write-up about this if you're interested. And then it was empty. So another improvement association, the Factory and Inducement Company, pretty clear what their purpose is, bought Somerset Street and all that property, and they offered that property for free and other inducements for businesses to come here. So how successful were they? Well, we know of a couple businesses that were there for a decade or 2, small businesses, an ice cream factory, that kind of thing. There was a spool and bobbin factory that started there and then burnt down the same year, so that was the end of that. And then they attracted this guy. Hugh A. Smith, H.A. Smith. And who knows how that's going to turn out, right? Hugh Smith grew into Rockwell. Rockwell eventually brought 400 jobs to Hopewell. That's a home run. And you can't tell, when you're inducing people to come, you have no idea. So you just got to try. And every now and then you strike lightning. So Hugh Smith came to Hopewell in 1900. He was a mechanic. He wanted to start a machine shop. He had a couple family members with him. So he started a shop up Somerset with the help of the inducement company. Within 3 years, he built the factory building you see in the top right here. That building's now gone. It's where the parking lot is across the street from Rockwell. And by 1915, he was employing 40 people. So that's a good deal already, right? In 1927, he built his first factory building on Somerset, the beginning of what we know as the Rockwell Quiltronic campus there. And that's the building in the bottom left. That building is still part of that complex. If you go look at it, you can see that building there. Amazingly not, all glued together with all the other buildings in Rockwell. And then he eventually sold the business, and that external company eventually became Rockwell International, which kept expanding the plant here and eventually got up to 400 employees. And then when Rockwell left, Quiltronic was here. So this property here had a 100-year run, providing up to 400 jobs in Hopewell, thanks to an inducement company. That's what the people of Hopewell were doing at the time. And they attracted people to Hopewell who gave back as well. So Hugh A. Smith was twice elected mayor of Hopewell, and he gave the building, which is now the museum, that's the building we saw earlier, to the town of Hopewell. And then Herbert Rockwell was the Rockwell guy in town running the Rockwell business, and he gave back over and over to Hopewell, sponsoring events, giving fire engines to the fire company. His employees, he started a small fire company, so his employees were set to start fires, and when the fire bell rang, they emptied out Rockwell and went running off to fight fires. So big benefit to the town, not only in the jobs, but in the people who came to town because of the jobs. Okay, so let's conclude with a little bit of legacy. Okay, so one legacy of the train coming to Hopewell is this train station, obviously. And the difference between this train station and, for example, Pennington and other places is this train station is part of the town. So there was this whole development along this block here of small businesses and housing because the train station was here. And then there was all that industrial development down here. So this was a busy area. This wasn't separate from the town. This wasn't somewhere else you went. In Pennington, the two train stations were far apart, and the train station that remained is sort of set back from the town and didn't have that kind of development around it. So actually, we know some fun things about this train station. So on the bottom left is a frame from a video from 1947. Yes, we have video from 1947 of events around Hopewell. If you go to the website, you can find those on YouTube. You can watch the kids running off to look for Easter eggs, for example. And you can watch the parades and all kinds of stuff. So these are two ladies waiting at the train station for the train to arrive. And then the bottom right, still passengers here in 1976, waiting for the train to arrive. So we know about the end of the train station in town because the last station master in town was Mike Denshaw, and that's the picture you see here. That's Mike Denshaw at this station. And we know about him because his daughter, Joanne Denshaw, told us. So she was wonderfully helpful in telling us about this station. She came here as a kid. She roller skated around in this room as a kid, and she saw how her dad interacted with the people of the town. The Denshaw family also lived in the Pennington train station, so she has a really unique perspective on all of this. And I do have a train station talk and write up online. You can find out more about that there. So what she said is, Hopewell was a busier station, not necessarily just by passenger count, but because of the number of neighbors and visitors who stopped by every day. Some regulars just came to talk with Dad and exchange news. This was a community center in Hopewell because it was part of this town. Other frequent guests included staff from the Hopewell Valley News. You saw the picture right across the street. And the neighboring deli. There were multiple delis along here, the mail carrier, and quite a few railroad buffs and tradespeople of all kinds. So along here we had food, we had a shoe store, we had taxi business for the train earlier. There was a livery, horses, park your horses for the train, and which later turned into auto repair, which is still here. And other businesses along here. The post office was here for a while as well. This was a busy, busy area. And the building that encapsulates this in my last slide is Chubby's. Okay. So Chubby's, the store on the corner here, was obviously here because the train station was here and all those commuters were going through. And it started as a sundries kind of store for commuters, but also serving the neighborhood because there was a full neighborhood here as well. So we have records going back to 1890 of that building as a store. And then in the early 1900s, it was Mrs. John Gould's store and Mrs. Von Steeg's store. They called it a confectionery, a sundries kind of store. And the top right picture is Mrs. Von Steeg's store. And the building's actually a duplex, and her store was only the front of one of the sides of that building. It's now the entire building, but that's how it started out. Then, starting in 1925, it was Ewing's Corner Store. So this was known as the corner store for a long period of time. And then he started a luncheonette there too. So it was starting to move from a commuter-focused business to a town-focused business, becoming a town center. And then in the 50s and 60s, it was Jimmy's Corner Store. So that's Jimmy and Red Hall. And they had a full fountain service. So again, they were serving both masters. And they were, the way they measured the traffic was by selling newspapers. So very early in the morning, the train would come by and throw the newspapers off. And people today remember as kids working there for Jimmy and laying out stacking those newspapers, laying them out, huge rows of newspapers for the commuters every day. And then on Sunday, it was the Sunday paper, not for commuters, for all the local people as well. So just a vast amount of traffic going through. Mm-hmm. And then eventually evolved into Rose and Chubby's, where it was totally a luncheonette. It really wasn't a commuter store anymore because the train service was shutting down. And now it's Chubby's Luncheonette. So it's now a local fixture, and it's where people hang out. It's where kids go. It's where the early morning tradespeople still go and get their coffee. And, it's for families and all kinds of people. And it's also an example of giving back. So Chubby's has the Chubby's Project going, giving back to the community through its food funds. So it's just really, this is just a great little example of what happened in Hopewell. So we can conclude here by saying we actually can see how these people were living and what they were doing and what they were trying to do and what they accomplished in this town. And we have their words and we have their actions. We have those write-ups, we have the newspapers. So it's just tremendously helpful. And we see their legacy in several different ways. One way is the streetscape. So most of the buildings in Hopewell are 1870s and later, and it's these people who built it, the people who came to town who built houses to last and businesses to last. So you look at like the tomato factory building, it doesn't look like anything fancy. It's an antique mall now. But that is a tough building. You go inside and you can see all the pillars and all the structure in there. That building was built to last. And you see the legacy in our institutions. So the churches, the library, the museum, the fire company, the water company, all of these private people raising money, building structures, funding, and volunteering to make these things happen, still happening here today. And just the general legacy of community service, making Hopewell a better place, because that's what these people were doing. They were working really hard to make Hopewell a better place, which is really, really fun to see. So thank you all very much. One more example is the Hopewell Tin Toy Factory, which was over there on Burton Avenue, next to our esteemed host this evening. And I'm doing a talk on them next Wednesday night. So if you want to see those tin toys from the 1920s, we'll be showing them as well. But that doesn't count as major industrialization, right? Anyway, so thank you all very much.
Was Rockwell the company that made taxi meters?
Yes. Yeah, Rockwell moved their entire taxi meter business here for an extended period. And we have some of those meters at the museum, for example. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
What's a hay press?
A hay press. Yeah, good question. You have all that hay, you want to move it. It would be nice if you could compact it. So you shove it in a little box and then have a circular thing that pushes it down. And then you get some horses and mules and they walk in circles. So it's literally compressing the hay into the blocks of hay that we're familiar with today. And in the old days, it was horses walking around in a circle and making that happen. So you had to bring your hay here to make it happen. Eventually, they developed portable hay presses. So the hay press person would go out to the farm and press at the farm. But in this early period, there were several hay presses in Hopewell. Important enough to have their own sidings.
Yeah.
You know,
Was it
it's a
sort
big
of like
business.
making a bale of hay?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, exactly. Right. Bales of hay. Yeah.
Was not Smith Machine also where the chocolate and the shirt factory was? Smith Machine Factory?
Smith may have used the chocolate factory building.
Yeah.
There's some evidence of that, but not a whole lot. We don't understand what happened there.
So you don't know where it was or wasn't there? I thought it was.
Well, I think they overflowed into there and did some business there in that chocolate factory building, but exactly what they were doing, I have no idea. Sorry, it's very frustrating. Some things we just don't know, and that's one of them. Yeah, so people mention it in passing, yes, Smith was in there, but that's all we got.
Well, the museum is where the Smiths lived.
Yes, yeah, so that was Smith's house. Yeah.
They had the factory, I know, but I thought it was there.
Yeah, it's frustrating. Yeah. Yeah, his original factory was up Somerset. The second was in the parking lot across from Rockwell, and then he started the build out of what we now call Rockwell. So he was focused there in his construction. Yeah. Dana?
Oh, yeah. So there were 3 sidings, one for the lumberyard, then one for Bill.
Yes.
And then there's a siding that ends
Yes.
over here. So what was this siding for?
Miscellaneous usage that wasn't dedicated to one company, basically. So the story is they pull in boxcars, which were ground level here, whereas down there they were raised because you dumped the coal out of them. So the boxcars were at ground level. So this is where you deliver cattle, for example. So the stories is they emptied cattle and ran them up Blackwell Avenue to sell them at the hotel up there. And the people of Blackwell Avenue was not thrilled with that. And so there was good fencing along Blackwell Avenue because of that. But, and then eventually the Hills siding closed and Hills was using this siding here as well. We have photos of piles of lumber by that as well. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
What are some other examples of what the train brought to town or took away from the town?
Or took away from the town?
Yeah.
Yeah, these are the big things.
Lumber.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff. I mean, people could commute, so that's obviously a big deal. It's hard to quantify.
For work or for pleasure?
Both as well. I mean, there's stories of a guy who worked on the railroad, lived here in Hopewell, had to move because he got a different job, so he moved into the Bronx or something. But he left his son behind who was finishing up high school in his last year. And so the son would visit his family on the weekend. So he'd hop the train, go into New York, switch to the ferry, switch to the subway, switch to the train, and that was his normal commute. So that was fine. Yeah. And then there's reaching out to the Sourlands, for example. So a lot of people lived up there. They didn't have good cars or good transportation. So how did they get supplies? So people started supply businesses, and this kid was worked on with one of those. So you pack up your truck with a whole bunch of stuff and head up the mountain and run a route there to feed those people. So yeah, it went both ways. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Do you know anything about the frequency of trains coming in and out, and also when did they start using those timetables?
Did they use timetables? Oh, way back. Yeah. So we have a collection of timetables. If you look up the talk on train stations, there's a bunch of information there. So you can see the frequency of trains coming up and going down over time, which is frustrating. But for a period, there were lots and lots of trains definitely through here. Then they started skipping stops, so they'd stop in Hopewell and Pennington, but not some of the other places as well. But yeah, we have quite a collection of timetables. Thank you. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, does Pennington and Belmead and other small towns along the Reading line here have similar stories?
Yeah, I don't know as much. Pennington had, if you go to Pennington today, there's the stuff towards 31. But there's sidings there still, raised elevated sidings. And then that was a whole construction or business site. And then further up the tracks in the other direction, if you come off Route 131 into the long road into Pennington, there's that industrial area there on the right as well. But you didn't have this nexus of small business and multiple largest businesses that happened at Hopewell. And a lot of that was the geography. This land was free and available. So yeah. Belmead and others had some large businesses, but I don't think quite the same extent here. Any more burning questions, or should we let you go? The latter. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.